actuelle de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des projets, programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière Cashew, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cashew, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cashew que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Bongo, Albori, Zoukoli, du centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cashew. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, mes impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
TechnoServe travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas assez à la tête, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons à ce que les femmes soient prises en compte Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
Maya was founded in 1993 and listed on the AirShare market in 2012. Maya is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Maya is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, scorched separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Maya brand new cashew color sorter, equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data, can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro color difference, mold and spores, which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Maya is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaku. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé à collaborer avec le projet Benekadjo. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadjo, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, À cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'anacardier, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce que il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benin Cashew nous a aidés parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'anacardier. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site modèle. Nous souhaitons que Benin Cashew continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Benin Cashew nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Benin Cashew pour ses apports à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
En relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Benin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites comme ceux qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales, qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, Technosève à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Ogui dans la commune de Savé et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technosève a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technosève nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew Technosève a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technosève est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technosève, identifié des arbres élites performants d'anacardier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec Technosève le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie, le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre pays.
Le rôle du pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, nos matériels végétal performants vont disparaître. Ce que Bénin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Bénin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté, j'ai prévu une pépinière. Avant Bénin Cashew, je produis 5000 plants. Je suis aujourd'hui à au moins 12 000 plants. Je vois un futur radieux devant moi.
actuelle de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la Covid-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des projets, programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, TechnoServe, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de TechnoServe pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et TechnoServe à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou, et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Borgo, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de TechnoServe via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cashew a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cashew a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Atta Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
MEA was founded in 1993 and listed on
Recording in progress. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today happens to be the last session for 2023. On behalf of the ACA Board and Management, I extend our heartfelt gratitude to everyone present here today and to our partners and sponsors who have continually made it possible to bring these sessions. As you all know, the session will be held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. And to access this service, please locate the globe icon on your screen, select your preferred language, and mute the original sound. For all questions and or need for clarification, please use the Q&A feature. And without taking much time, join me welcome Jim. Jim, good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. Good morning, everyone. How are you?
Doing very well, Jim, and you?
Yeah, not too bad at all. Looking forward to this last session of the year. This is number 61 in this series, believe it or not. I hope you're going to enjoy it. Today we're going to talk about the markets and the issues that arose during this year. It's a little bit of a look back, but it's also a look forward. And we look forward and see what we might expect in the coming year. So we'll talk about the markets. I'm not going to focus in on the current market so much. It's relatively quiet anyway. But we're going to have a look at the bigger picture. And then we'll have a look at some of the issues and some of the developments of 2023 that could have an impact into 2024 and beyond. So we'll start with the market. And I want to remind you, first of all, if you were with us, or if you weren't, 2 weeks ago, we talked about policy and we talked about the fairly dynamic policy environment that we've seen over the past 5, almost 10 years now, I suppose, in the cashew sector, particularly in West Africa. And we talked about development of policy. We talked about the impact that has had on the market. And right now, in any African country, you can't really separate the market and policy. There's been so much intervention. So we need to bear that in mind as we look through this and think about some of the issues and some of the areas that relates to. But let's start our look at 2023 by looking at production, the trends in production and where it is taking us. So as you can see on your screen, again, pretty good crop in 2023. I looked at the growth over the last 5 years and 10 years, and it's around about the same. The difference in the last 5 years is that growth has been driven from Cambodia. You can see the big step up 2020, 2021, and over the last 2 years too. Prior to that, growth was mainly driven from West Africa. So it looks like we'll have what was only 10 years ago a figure that we almost dreaded or dreamed about, whichever way you want to look at it. We could have a 5 million ton crop by 2025. That's even possible next year, but more likely 2025 or after that. So that brings us to a key issue. The current growth is driven by the high prices seen in the markets 2016 to 2018, particularly if we look in Cambodia, particularly if we look at the growth spurt, so to speak, in Cote d'Ivoire over the last 2 seasons. And the question is, will that growth be sustained in a period of lower prices? And the likelihood is that even though we have a new record production this year and almost every year, that it will be impacted by lower prices. And lower prices can impact cashews in a number of ways. It can certainly impact the number of new trees that are planted, but it also can impact the care and attention paid to the crop. Pre-harvest and post-harvest, that impacts quality and it impacts outturn, and therefore it impacts the volume. So there was a time where we would have taken a figure of maybe 24% as the conversion factor, but today we'll use 22%. And that's just an indication of the differences in quality over the last 20 years or so. We have today about 2 million tons more cashews in the world than we had 10 years ago every year. Demand has grown almost as quickly throughout that period, and as we'll see, demand is continuing to grow. A quick update on the current situation before we move on, and it does look on the intake so far that Tanzania could reach close to the 300,000 tons. That would be a terrific crop in Tanzania given the last couple of years. It won't be a record. The record is, I think it's 313, but it looks like a very good crop on what we've seen so far. Mozambique, on the other hand, it looks as if with some of the early trade and some of the intake that the target or the estimate of 160,000 tons might be a little bit higher than the actual crop by the time we get to the end of the season. So let's have a look at the cashew production globe, and let's have a look at how this has affected the balance. So in general terms, what we see again, a pattern which was reversed in 21 and 22, but what we see again is that the share of Asian producers is dropping. The red arrows mean it's going down. So Southeast Asia, for example, peaked at 23% of the world crop, and now it's dropped back to 20%. And that's a couple of reasons. A big crop in Cote d'Ivoire this year, good crops throughout West Africa, driving West Africa's share back up to 49%, and a smaller crop, certainly then in 2021, in Cambodia. And we wonder now, was that 2021 crop really 1 million tons? I've never really believed that. The figures don't suggest that. And we're probably thinking that Cambodian production will probably rise, but it won't rise as quickly as might have been expected. So it looks like after 2023 that a crop in the region of 650, perhaps 700,000 tons will be about the norm in the coming years. So in short, we expect growth to slow down. The shift towards Africa continues. The struggle of the major processing countries, Vietnam and India, to secure raw material continues to be a feature in the world market. Let's have a look then at the situation at the beginning and the end of the year. Well, the big story early in 2023 was the high carry-in stock in India, following terrific imports in 2022. And we looked at a figure probably in the region of 320,000 tons of carry-in. It wasn't all RCN, some of it had already been processed. During the course of the year, it looks as if most of it has been processed and most of it has indeed been used. And thus we see India's imports of RCN pretty strong as the year goes on. So I don't think that we will see at the end of 23 a situation where there's let's say an over carry out in India. In Vietnam, while much is made of the inventories knocking around in Vietnam, we should remember the volume of nuts that are processed every month in Vietnam. So it looks to me as if the carry in and the carry out is about 2 to 2.5 months of supply. Some of that is lower quality. Some of it is in transit. Some of it is problem stock. Doesn't look as if there's any particular struggle, but Vietnamese buyers will need to continue to buy, and they will continue to support the market, just as their Indian buyers will too, once they have assessed the Diwali demand and how their stocks lie at the moment. So that means in Africa, we are looking to most of the product is exported. The carry-in, relatively low to moderate carry-in. I don't think there's anything particular to worry about. I suppose one thing we should say is that Guinea-Bissau struggles towards the end of the year to move its material. A lot is going through Senegal these days, and that can have an influence. And of course, it's not good news for farmers in Guinea-Bissau, and possibly not good news for farmers in Senegal either. The other indicator that the carry-in stocks will not be too prohibitive at destinations is that the Tanzanian auction has been going quite well. Yet prices have dropped back in the last week, but in terms of volume, the auction looks pretty healthy this year. I may well need a little bit of realism from the authorities at the auction to make sure that the rest of the crop moves and moves quickly. So production, a record within the trend, nothing special in that sense. Carry out looks to have been dealt with, carry out from 2022, and the carry into 2024 looks very manageable. It may well be said that due to extraordinary demand, we have got to a situation again where we're looking at a much more balanced year going forward. Of course, depending on the new crop to come from February onwards. So let's have a look at demand. And we have a look, first of all, at the raw cashew nut side. Demand for raw cashew nuts in 2023 has been remarkable. Vietnam's imports are up by 46%. Now, I use the Vietnam Customs Authority's figures. You will see other figures around, slightly higher, suggesting 51% increase. It's not a huge difference, but I just thought it's important to mention that. So looking at this chart, what you can see is that we have had a series of record months for import of raw cashew nuts. In fact, if we look at the 10.5 months of 2023 so far from an import figure point of view, already in 10.5 months, Vietnam has imported more raw cashew nuts than in any other year in history. It's pretty remarkable. If we look at the cumulative situation, you can see the red bars representing the monthly cumulative in 2023 and the lines representing the cumulative totals in each of the other months. Again, you'll notice 2021 is missing simply because those figures in 2021 are certainly not correct. They're certainly not believable. And we look at the figures and we see an extraordinary increase over the period. And if we look at the sources of supply, there's a couple of interesting factors emerging from that. Firstly, Cambodia's supply is down by 100,000 tons. That is Cambodia's official export and import in Vietnam, down to 611,000 tons, 100,000 tons less. That's an interesting factor. Côte d'Ivoire, for the time of year, the imports are very, very strong, 783,000 tons. That's really moved up quickly. That indicates earlier shipment. Nigeria, much higher figures. Just how those figures come about is difficult enough to understand. I think there's got to be an element of cross-border trade in there somewhere. And Ghana, again, due to a better crop and also, again, due to a certain amount of cross-border trade, Ghanaian imports into Vietnam are really healthy. So what we're looking at is a concentration of the increase. Cambodia, Côte d'Ivoire, Nigeria, and Ghana, the beneficiaries in raw cashew nut terms. On the other hand, we have to wonder, what does that mean for cashew processing in those countries? And certainly, if you look at Nigeria's cashew kernels exports figures, at least in relation to Western markets, you're looking at quite a sharp drop off. I was looking at the US Nigeria figures last night, and we are looking at quite a sharp drop off in exports there. So very healthy position for Vietnam, big volumes. They must be doing something right despite their protests. By the way, I should mention that these figures include the Burma kernels, and I'll talk to you more about that shortly. So let's have a look at India. I've mentioned that India has managed to deal with its carry-in stock very successfully this year. That's a really positive indicator for demand. Again, the blue bars represent the monthly cumulative for 2023, and the lines represent each of the other years on the same basis. Now, it was never going to be that 2023 would approach the 2022 figure, itself a record, as you can see, reaching 1.4 million tons. But it does look very healthy. These are the Vietnam customs figures until the end of September. So India, will certainly cross 1 million tons this year. Maybe 1.1 looks possible. Let's see. So this indicates strong demand, strong imports, management of the carry-in, what they call the net disappearance over the year, which means basically, what did you do with the crop? What did you do with the imports? What did you do with the carry-in? It looks strong, and that is a really strong indicator of yet another year of strong demand in India. And if we look at India, my estimate is that in 2023, India will consume about 37% of the world's crop, absolutely miles ahead of second place. So the next biggest destination market is less than 20%. If India experienced 5% annual growth, that's about 80,000 tons of raw cashew nuts extra every year. So if that were to happen in each of the years until 2030, India would need to grow or to import an additional 650,000 tons of raw cashew nuts. And that is the equivalent of the entire Cambodian crop in 2023. So we're getting into a situation now, as this market has grown so quickly in the last 10 years, where we're getting into the effect of big numbers. If you grow a big number by a small number, you get a big number. So a huge Indian consumption with a 5% annual increase really mounts up very quickly. And that would be an indicator that the period of time, as we've spoken about on this webinar previously, the period of time between the current surplus and returning to deficit may be a lot shorter than people might expect. So, pretty interesting year in India. I do not see anything on the immediate horizon that would knock the growth in Indian demand back. Certainly, economic conditions could change. It could slow down. But it seems likely that the growth in cashew consumption in India is going to be very strong in the coming years. Looking at the kernel side, so the big number, of course, to look at is the remarkable increase in the exports from Vietnam. So this is January to October over the last 7 years. And what you're seeing is 8.5% growth. Now you've seen what a 5% growth rate in India would do to the supply and demand situation. What would a continued 8.5% growth in exports from Vietnam do? The numbers start to get very large very quickly. So with the new record export expected from Vietnam in 2023, and with continued strength in demand in India, the outlook starts to become a little bit more optimistic. Now, that does not mean that there's a shortage or anything like a shortage in 2024, but it does mean over the longer period, we need to, again, reassess the trajectory for production. We need to reassess marketing, and we need to reassess how this market functions. So think about the prospect, for example, of a 5 million ton raw cashew nut trade across the globe, and whether or not that's sustainable, and whether it's desirable, and whether it's practically workable. And that could be the case if processing at origin doesn't continue to grow and grow quickly. Let's go back to demand and have a look then at individual markets. So I looked at the top destinations. So we're looking at 10 months figures, of course, 2022 versus 2023. And what we see is that 22 of the 25 top destinations from Vietnam show strong growth. If we take the 3 top destinations, China, the Netherlands, and the USA, each market shows significant growth. China particularly strong, but last year wasn't a great year for China trade. It's much stronger this year, starts to look really good again. Europe, represented by the Netherlands, the top importer, which then redistributes. Yes, it's up. It's positive given the performance last year, growing a little bit more slowly. And similarly for the United States. So in the US figures, I have combined processed and natural kernels, because that's becoming more and more a factor. So if we look at that, we can see US and Canada exports from Vietnam up 9%. The top 9 countries in Europe, because it's October, I don't have all of the figures for all of the countries, but the top 9, about 13%. And the top 9 account for in excess of 85% of the overall import. But the Middle East and China and Asia excluding China, that is, all show very strong growth. So we're seeing a real return to form in those countries. And I think it's safe to say that the future of demand growth in the cashew sector is in Asian countries. And that's something that we need to focus on, particularly from an African point of view, because all of the location advantage, if we consider West Africa, for example, all of the location advantage is if we consider US, Canada, and Western Europe as our target markets. But if we look at the Middle East and China, it's a much more level playing field competing with processors in India, in Vietnam, in Cambodia, or elsewhere. So I thought I'd focus in on probably the weakest performing market of the major markets this year, the US, and try to see if we can have a look at some of the numbers there. So what you can see, again, monthly imports of cashew kernels, month by month, the red bars represent 2023. And what we're seeing towards the latter part of this period, the figures are until September, what we're seeing toward the latter part of this period is that it's beginning to improve compared to last year and better again than 2020. But the record imports of 2021, which in fact I suspect are the root of the problem in terms of the overall decline in imports last year, it's still well behind those. Now, if we go back earlier in the year, we can notice that the monthly imports were below the corresponding period in previous years. So can we say there is an improvement? Certainly. July to September looks to be improved. I looked at the figures of export from Vietnam for September and October to the United States, and I think we can expect that to continue. At the moment, we're around about, I think it's 6.83% down on last year, which is disappointing. The second half of last year was remarkably disappointing, and it looks as if this year will probably finish down, but probably not by as much as we might have feared early in the year. So far, I think it's fair to say that the US market is not responding to the lower prices, but we are beginning to see some changes in that. And as you can see, if we look at the cumulative situation, it just confirms where we stand in relation to the other years. One thing that is looking a bit more positive in the US is the import of roasted and packed cashew kernels. So under this tariff heading, we get most of the single nut cashews. So we get roasted cashews in bulk and some of the consumer packs. And if we look at the figure cumulative to September, we can see already by September, 2021 has been exceeded. And it looks as if over the following 3 months that we will reach and surpass the figure of the 2022 import. So this is almost exclusively coming from Vietnam. So of the 25,000 tons that have come in so far, more than 18,000 tons are from Vietnam. Other contributors are India. The Indian figure is around about 1,700 tons from Thailand, with a figure, I think it's 1,600 tons from Thailand in the 9 months to the end of September. This is an interesting trend, and this is, it's becoming a trend in which the importer imports a roasted product and ends up competing with the existing roasters. How that will pan out over the coming years remains to be seen. We know that it is policy, and probably a good policy in Vietnam, to increase value addition. Whether or not that's focused on the US market remains to be seen. But it wouldn't be surprising to see Vietnamese processors and importers competing in tenders with supermarkets in the coming years. And that could be a fundamental factor in changing the structure of the US market. It could, for example, encourage roasters to go directly to origin, to source. It could indeed cause roasters to look more closely at alternative supply, possibly in West Africa in the coming years. So this is one really to keep an eye on. It is a changing structure of the market. Obviously, closely allied to demand and demand considerations is prices. So this year we saw a pattern where raw cashew nut prices started quite high, probably too high in my view. And as kernels prices fell, which they did, they probably fell too far. And we've seen a little bit of a rebound on that in the last few weeks. Now, it's bound to happen when you get such large volumes imported into the two major destinations. So if we look at this situation, you would have to say that raw cashew nut prices are relatively low. They don't quite correspond to kernels prices in some ways, and that there is room for those prices to stay steady for the rest of the season. If we look at the cashew kernel situation, well, again, we've seen prices fall and stabilize throughout the year. Probably brokens have fallen this year by more than the whole grades. Now, as I'm going to talk to you about in a moment, this may not necessarily represent the situation. We have seen a year where the price has ranged from $2.70 down to $2.40. The simple monthly average is $2.54 for 320s. We always talk about 320s when we talk about average prices. And it looks as if these prices certainly remain very attractive. Probably more volume was traded this year at the lower end because the averages only take into account the prices that were quoted, not the volumes that were traded. And we're looking at a situation, I think, where coming into the new year, a lot of people may have sales at relatively low prices, which is always an interesting dynamic in the market. Also interesting is the look at prices from African countries. So I can't look at every origin, so I thought I'd look at the biggest one, the biggest exporter of cashew kernels, Côte d'Ivoire. So we looked at prices, first of all, in the market. So these are the quoted FOB prices in the market. And we try to take a mid-range processor. So we don't take the very highest quality processor and we don't take the very lowest. As you know, there is quite a gap, 15, even 20 cents a pound gap between the lowest and cheapest processor and the top class forward selling, perhaps with a high level of food safety certification processor. That's the Vietnamese price. Then we charted prices from Côte d'Ivoire on FOB basis. And you can see that in 2022, late 21 into 2022, a big gap emerged. So we have to explain that. And that was explained by differences in freight. So the freight rates from Asia went very high during that period, during and post-COVID. And that to a certain extent explained. So the dotted red line is a correction indicating that there still was quite a price premium in that period for good African processors over Vietnamese product, but that has narrowed somewhat over the last 15 or 16 months. If we were to go back before 2020, you would tend to find this situation where African kernels are trading below the prices from Vietnam. You would tend to find that situation mirrored. Prior to 2019, certainly 2020, buyers would demand that their African suppliers, in many cases, would be below the price from Vietnam in order to buy from them. That's changed for a lot of reasons. Not least among them is quality, sustainability, better marketing from some African processors, and certainly better processing and more processing, so that we may even see Côte d'Ivoire this year, if not this year, definitely next year, Côte d'Ivoire will become a larger exporter than India in the kernels market. And that's quite an accolade. Mind you, if you consider the gap, 50,000 tons to 600,000 tons, being in second place doesn't mean an awful lot. So looking then at some of the issues. So I'm going to focus in now on some of the issues that I see that arose or continued this year and that may have caused the market to be difficult to understand, and that may well be big issues in 2024 and beyond. So the first issue, and we spoke about it quite a lot on this webinar over the 16 episodes in 2023, and prior to that too, and this issue is, how do processors in Asia sustain these low prices? Or to put it more crudely, how do Asian processors keep losing money? So we thought, let's have a look. And so we take the market price. Now, this again is the market price that we saw in the previous chart, FOB Vietnam, only for targeted markets in the West. And what has happened is that there is a premium market in the Middle East, in Asia, for Vietnamese processors, and there's a low quality market. And in Europe and the United States, you're the low quality market. So we get a situation where we have low quality cashews being sold into the markets with the highest food safety demands. Quite an interesting situation. So there's the market price. So I thought, let's look at the actual export price. And Vinacas has some good figures on this for 320, so I use those. So what we see is that the actual export value is way over the market. That's what you would expect in a market which has been falling and in a market which trades forward. So again, we have to distinguish a lot of the markets that would be regarded as high value markets, the Middle East, China perhaps. These quality markets don't tend to trade as far forward as markets in Europe and North America. So it's not unusual for European buyers to buy 6, 9, 12, or even more months forward. And that's what's represented by these exports. Of course, all exports are in there. So the exports to high value markets are in there too. So the direct comparison might be a little bit narrower. So then I said, okay, let's look at cost and let's see if we can work out based on the imported raw cashew nuts. So only on imported raw cashew nuts. And imported raw cashew nuts, apart from Cambodia, tend to be the lower end of the costs. In Vietnam, the local crop and the Cambodian crop trades at higher price. Why? Simply because it's closer and it's better quality. So when we look at cost, we get this picture. So now we're looking at actual export price and a calculated cost. Now that's a represented calculated cost. That's not individual processors' costs. You're losing money if the cost is higher than the export. So what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to take the raw cashew nut market 3 months before the export. Now 3 months may be not wide enough. And if it were not wide enough, then this gap would be bigger. But it is a strong indicator. So now we've taken cost and we've taken actual export, and they're roughly equivalent, which means that the only period, calculated at least, when money was being lost was in that period there. So that means that processors who had sold well forward and done so wisely and bought their raw cashew nuts roughly equating to market price and market quality were actually not in as bad a position as may have been thought. So part of the answer to the question, how do Asian processors keep losing money, is they don't. The market runs a lot differently to what we might expect. If you were selling raw cashew nuts today, or if I were, we would be told the kernel market is 240. How can you offer raw cashew nuts that equate to 250, 260? We won't make money, we won't buy them. But in actual fact, the business that's actually being shipped and paid for is at a higher price. So this is all about the balance of risk and the management of risk. One market selling forward, the other trading prompt, and it does create a huge risk. So how do you manage it? By the way, this picture is a picture from cashew kernels taken from a US retailer. This sample was represented as a quality sample, and these are some of the nuts that were in there. As you can see, if you know your cashew kernels, pretty shocking quality. Shockingly low, that is. How does that come about? So how do you manage it as a processor? Well, first of all, you establish yourself with scale and cost advantage, and that is already there in Vietnam. Then you establish a market for your lower quality because it's about lower cost. Isn't that what buyers in the US and the EU want? Well, it may be, it may not be, but it's certainly what's happened. So we've lower cost cashew kernels traveling to Western markets, and the quality, anyone who knows their cashew kernels will tell you the quality in the supermarkets in both of those major Western markets has declined remarkably over the last 20 years. So you've got a market for some of your lower cost. Now you've got a market for some of your premium products. You need to get into the Middle Eastern market, take some of the share from India, Japan, China, all that has happened. Now, to achieve strength in the US market, you need to sell forward. So in the US and EU, you sell forward and you take that risk. So you now have forward sales. You've got a falling market. You need to keep the pressure on the market because your prices are already established for your sales. The low kernels prices, which are, as we've seen, way below the actual price that you've sold at this stage, because you've sold forward, you've sold in this period for here, the market's then fallen. You're now buying your raw cashew nuts at the equivalent of these kernels prices, or trying to. So the lower kernels prices keeps the RCN price under control. At least that's the theory. The RCN market then reflects today's kernels market, not the kernels market that was traded when these contracts were actually done. And the only thing you need to do then is make sure you have a stock of raw cashew nuts during the off season when it's out of your control and there's no more new material arriving to the market. So this situation is driven by the scale and cost advantage in Vietnam, the willingness of US buyers particularly, but also European Union buyers, to accept a much lower quality cashew kernel. And of course, it's not all buyers, it's a general statement, but the willingness of those buyers to accept lower quality in return for a lower price. So we've gone from a situation where cashew kernel is a premium nut, premium quality, premium price, to becoming a cheaper nut, lower price, low quality. Certainly in comparison to what it was. And if you want to check that out, go and have a look at any product packed in Europe or in the United States and compare the quality to what you might pick up in India, in Middle Eastern countries, and just compare that quality and you'll see the difference. You can do that, by the way, because all of these products can be bought online nowadays. What is the impact of this situation? plainly, lower farm gate price in Africa. That's a fact. Maybe not lower than it was 10 years ago, but certainly lower than it could be. Lower raw material cost for the processor, which allows the situation to arise where they can't discern between the two markets. Pressure on the infrastructure in African countries. Why? Well, simply because now 2.7 million tons of raw cashew nuts need to be exported. 5 times the volume if that were kernels. So this keeps pressure on infrastructure, pressure on post-harvest infrastructure, pressure on handling and export. It keeps the pressure on the new processors. So keeping the market, the kernels market low, leaves the African processor constantly in the situation where they must argue, you need to pay us a higher price because our costs are higher, but also because our quality is higher, we're closer to you, and all of these factors that we've mentioned many times, but it keeps the pressure on them. And one of the key things there is that African processors are not in a position to sell forward. So that makes it more difficult for them when they deal with buyers in the US or Europe who can quite easily access forward supplies from Vietnam at low prices. And of course, and we see it increasingly, the processors are there to pick up the Burma kernels so that we end up with this kind of half process, lost value addition, and a system that becomes questionable. Impacts, low quality, we spoke about that. The idea being that in the West, we or they don't care about cost. They do care about cost, they don't care about quality. And that would seem to be the way it looks, despite all the talk. For many of the major buyers, that's what it looks like. And finally, it puts pressure on the small and medium processors at home in Vietnam. Now, the question we need to ask ourselves, is this system economically and environmentally sustainable? And from my perspective, it's a resounding no to that question. This is a short-term trading arrangement that can get into serious trouble in the event that we got a short crop, in the event that we got a significant price rise. So what would happen if prices went up? Well, what would happen if prices went up is what's always happened when prices go up on cashews. Contracts are renegotiated. And why wouldn't processors renegotiate contracts? Isn't that what their customers have often done in the past? When markets fall, the buyers renegotiate the contracts. When markets rise, the processors, many of them, have to renegotiate the contracts. RCN, well, you don't need me to mention about renegotiation of RCN and all the different guises that can take. Secondly, you stop buying RCN. If prices go up, you get out of the market, stay out of the market, and hope that raw cashew nuts prices moderate a little bit. And you develop a long-term answer. And the long-term answer in Vietnam, without a doubt to my mind, is higher levels of value addition. Roast it, pack it, process it, and ship it to destination markets, which is now possible because those markets do not have trade barriers other than meeting quality and food safety requirements. What happens if it really goes wrong? What happens if the risk explodes and the market becomes really difficult? If there was, it's unlikely, but if there was a crop failure in a major producing country, well, what happens is we have 2017 all over again. We have another price bubble. We've outright defaults of contract from every origin, higher raw cashew nut prices, a spiral, a bubble, which eventually bursts, as it did in 2018. And that's the roller coaster that this system is running on. In fact, if you think about it, the likelihood of that happening and the impact of it is greater now than at any time in the past. simply because the dependence on imported raw cashew nuts is greater, the market is larger, the prices are lower, the quality is lower, but particularly because the quality difference between high quality markets and low quality markets is wider than it's ever been before. It's surprising to me, after all the years in the cashew industry, to be saying to you that the US is a low quality cashew market. It would have been a leader in developing quality of cashews in the past. So what could change this? And I mean, what could change it within the possibilities of what may happen in the market in the coming years? Well, I think the first thing is, if buyers, particularly Western buyers who talk sustainability so well, if they were actually serious about it. So if they looked at the planet, if they looked at their supply chain, if they looked at the people that grow the cashews that they buy and treated them in a more sustainable fashion, as opposed to just trying to beat the cost down, that system would change. If we saw a refocus in African countries, instead of focusing simply on building processing plants, increasing the volume processed, feeding the demand, if we saw a refocus on integrating the supply chain and developing the supply chain. So that means that farmers become organized, farmer organizations are connected to processors. We look at the chain from the farm gate all the way through to export and beyond as an integrated system. At the moment, it's disjointed. There has been huge push toward processing, and that's been successful. I would applaud it. But the next step in that journey is to start to build a supply chain that's integrated and to develop that supply chain. The third factor that could change this, I think, is far more simple than the other two, and that's simply if African processors got more serious about marketing. If they started to look at marketing as a much more integral part of their business. I know it's not easy. It needs personnel, it needs training, it needs assistance. But unless it happens, then this justification of the price-cost gap becomes more and more difficult as time goes on. Now, there are other factors too that can change this, I think. For a moment. We're talking about other factors that can change this current situation, and some of them can be found in the laws in Western countries. So a key one, I think, is the development of the requirements for traceability and corporate responsibility in Western markets. In this case, Europe leads the way, and we saw in 2023 coming into force of the German Supply Chain Act, as we call it in English, and that this is more than likely to lead on to proposals at a European Commission level, at the European Union level, to introduce greater responsibility to put traceability at the forefront of risk management and food safety. And as we've said before, only origin processed kernels can fully meet these requirements. It really is not possible otherwise. Third big issue that I saw myself at first hand in 2023, working with the Lift Cashew project, is the impact of informal trade on borders. I mean, this has positives, it has negatives. We should remember when we look at all of these things, there are some positive aspects to it, but certainly differences in policy and taxation across closely linked countries where there has been a traditional and a long-term cross-border trade has an impact. And this is something that needs to be looked at. And it particularly is impactful on the costs. So one of the things we noticed looking at this in the Sagabi region with Lift Cashew was the impact of the cross-border trade on costs of logistics. So it's an interesting fact. Smuggling, you may not pay the tax, but you might pay a hell of a lot more for your trucking and logistics costs. That's something that I think is becoming a big issue and will be a big issue in 2024. Looking at another issue, Burma kernels. Look at the chart. These are kernels imports to Vietnam. I have UN Comtrade figures for 4 years, and we have VinaCast figures for the last 2 years, and recent VinaCast figures for 2023. These are big numbers. And this has been growing quickly. And this is a reflection on the African processing industry. So as I said, if you keep an industry under pressure, if you keep it weak, you can take advantage in the Burma kernels trade. But it's as much the processor's problem as it is the buyer's advantage. Now it's interesting if we look at some of the prices, and these prices really surprise me.
Jim? Hello, Jim?
Yes.
Can you please pause for a moment? Apparently the French interpretation is not coming on.
Certainly. So just while we're waiting for that, we're talking about some of the big issues in 2023 and how they might impact the market in 2024.
Hello, Jim, please, we may continue now.
Well, thanks, Blessing. Okay, so we've been talking about big issues, and we're talking about so-called Burma kernels. This includes partially peeled, unpeeled, and a range of different versions of this trade. Some people call them KTW, I think, in Côte d'Ivoire. Key issue for me is that the prices recorded and published by VinaCast are very difficult to reconcile with the market. As you can see, throughout this year, we're looking at some very high prices on the import of Burma kernels. I have no explanation for this. I'm asking questions. Is there some kind of transfer pricing going on the import? Is it a way to move money? Cashews have often been used in that way in the past. The values look very, very high. Maybe there's some other factor. Maybe there's some error in the numbers. But it is a cause of concern in Vietnam. And it was suggested earlier this year in discussions by some people that Vietnam should tax Burma kernels. It was a 25% import tax was mentioned, because this is suggested in Vietnam as taking away from the strength of the industry. Obviously, Vietnamese processors would rather import RCN and convert it than Burma kernels. It's a strange trade. It's absolutely not the answer for the African processing industry. And African countries should make this a big issue. I think this is a huge issue. The trade in Burma kernels says to the rest of the world that processing in Africa doesn't work. And if we look at the impact, there's a loss of revenue, a loss of jobs, there's a loss of tax revenue, and there is serious brand damage. And the one that bothers me the most of those is the serious brand damage. I think it gives all the wrong messages to the rest of the world, particularly buyers. And if we look at the reaction, so we see really positive reaction. Mozambique is now taxing Burma kernel exports at 15% by value. India has banned the import of Burma kernels. But Côte d'Ivoire still, surprisingly, subsidizes the processing and thereby the export of Burma kernels. That actually encourages the trade. So this trade says, for me, that processing in Africa cannot work. We know that's not true now. We know that governments, processors look at the advantages, pick up on the advantages, encourage processing, but then in some way allow the trade that undermines those advantages to continue. So you regulate everything else, but with the exception of Mozambique, you don't regulate this trade. It makes absolutely no sense to me. Would there be less processing Africa if this trade didn't exist? I don't think so. Would processors be losing more money or making less? What it would do is it would force them to do the marketing, the quality, the certification that's required. And there's also the question of exactly what is the logic of this trade? What does it do? Is it a way of moving money around? And that needs to be looked at. Serious issue. It should become a very serious issue in 2024. The next thing I'd like to look at is the fact of processors operating below their capacity. And this is a factor across the continent. So last week we looked at methods to support, and we talked about supporting value addition without creating state-dependent processors. We have to ask, do supports work? What are the supports? Do they work? And I just looked at two. And if we ask ourselves, if we take the ban on imports, or the very high level of taxation, an effective ban on imports of kernels into India, if we ask ourselves, what would happen in India if kernels imports were allowed from Vietnam? The answer is pretty clear. The damage to the processing sector would be immense. It would take years to repair it. They would repair it, but it would take perhaps 10 years, who knows, in order to repair that damage. Secondly, if we look at Côte d'Ivoire, and what will happen in Côte d'Ivoire if and when processing subsidies are phased out. So I think a big issue in the coming year and beyond is the issue of processors operating below their capacity, because that's affecting their profitability, their viability, their ability to raise funding, and how the various support mechanisms, which absolutely have been successful in establishing processing, but how do they phase out? How long should they last? And what's the impact of that? Second factor in this area of processors operating below capacity is the idea of the industrial park. And this is becoming popular in many countries now. It's something that makes sense to engineers and accountants, and certainly to politicians. It's like a quick fix for a big challenge. But we also have to consider these units often located in the wrong place in terms of the cashew supply. What's the impact on the existing factories? What's the impact on farmers? And how does that need for workers in the factories and managers of the factories, how does that play out in terms of the overall sector? So, for example, does it move all the managers and all the staff to a certain area away from where other factories are located? And what's the long-term impact of that on the sector? So we really do need to look at this. And there have been some successes and there have been some failures of the major industrial parks, but how they're organized, who operates them, where they are, and what is their impact on the supply chain, this is a big issue in the coming years. And we see this discussed right across West Africa, the idea of centralized, large industrial cashew processing units. Also, in relation to managing processing technology and capacity, we have to look at a lot of issues now in terms of how do we get these factories in a position where they can operate to their capacity. A lot has changed. The increase in scale, the mechanized processing, and the number of factories which are unfortunately obsolete now are all big factors weighing on the market. When we look at the challenges and we look at the opportunities, the need for working capital. If you've got a bigger factory, you need more working capital. You need more capital expenditure. You need to buy machines. You need a reliable power supply. You need to be able to manage those machines, and you need to be able to market, because you're going to break more kernels. And a lot of these in countries across Africa have not been addressed as yet. Working capital stands out. Power supply stands out. I was lucky enough to be in Benin earlier this year and listening to good factories, good people telling me that their big problem was that they could not get connected to the supply of electricity, a basic need for industrial development. There are also opportunities in this: faster entry to the market, reduced labor dependence. So you can get into business quicker because you've fewer people to train, and you need fewer people. Your costs should be lower, but that only comes if you can reach something near to capacity, maybe 80-85% of capacity. And there is greater reliability, and of course, food safety becomes easier simply because you're mechanized, fewer people, more machines. It's easier to maintain that within the parameters of a HACCP program and more advanced certifications. So these are big issues around processing. Are industrial parks the right way to go? How do we manage the challenges of modern processing? How do we get factories up to capacity so that they can be competitive? There are a couple of other issues I want to draw to your attention. And in 2023, we heard, probably for the first time in cashews, this issue of deforestation. And I put it like this. This is a slide I used at the ACA conference earlier this year. And this is the way I put it. Here we are, and unfortunately, particularly Europeans, here we are looking at traffic, waste, pollution, air travel, and pointing at people living in villages growing cashews and saying, it's their problem. Deforestation is their problem, they've done it. And we sit in our aircraft overlooking that. How ridiculous. And the fact is that, according to some estimates I've heard, that in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, less than 4% of the cashew trees are on deforested land. And even what that means is not clear. So we really need to look at this issue. And this could become a big issue, and it shouldn't be, because it's just not a fact. What it will do is create a lot of work for consultants. There'll be a lot of reports written, and there'll be a lot of people trying to prove what is obvious to many of us, and that is that processing at origin hugely reduces the carbon footprint of the cashew sector. Of that, I have no doubt. So what can we look forward to? Well, I think more of the same. A volatile environment. We're going to see a continued production shift to West Africa now that production in Asia seems again to have stabilized. Now that it's almost certain that growth of production in Vietnam, Cambodia, and India will be relatively slow in the coming years. We will see, sooner or later, we're going to see a boom-bust cycle. I hope it's not sooner, but it's going to happen. We're going to see this supply-demand match, which in the last 2 years has moved over towards surplus. It looks on what we see now that it's going to move back the other direction. And we're going to see in the next 5 years, again, a deficit situation arise. That will make the chances of a boom-bust cycle much more likely. I think we'll see some rationalization in Vietnam. We may also see some rationalization in West Africa, but they're in the context of further growth. And I think we'll see politicians probably in all countries, but especially in West Africa, we'll see politicians continue to increase regulation in response to some of these areas. And we have to look again for these unintended consequences, the impact of poor information, the impact of reactive policy. But look for further changes, perhaps increase in regulation caused by this continued dynamic environment and continued structural change in the cashew market. But the biggest issue of all for me is, in Africa, is building on the progress that's been made so far. How to deal with the short-term problems, like volatility in the market, considering, is the African cashew chain aligned with customers' needs? So, for example, how can we encourage buyers in markets where there is a location advantage, which might mean Europe or the US, how can we encourage those buyers to value higher quality, to value traceability, to value sustainability? And how can we encourage them to do that before their own legal system tells them that they must? Longer term, can production rise to meet demand? That's not for this year or next year, maybe not even the year after. But from 2030 onwards, that again becomes a question. And we all know how long it takes for a cashew tree to yield a crop. If that does happen, will the infrastructure be able to cope? So if we had a situation, for example, where there's, instead of 2.7 million tons being exported, that became 5 million tons, would the infrastructure be able to cope? And the answer is probably no. And there is an answer, and that answer is to develop processing. But in order for production to rise, growers must be offered a way out of their low incomes. Generally, cashews, and generally is an understatement, almost all cashews are grown by smallholders. And growers need to be incentivized to produce cashews. And a way to incentivize them is to improve their standards of living by offering them better prices, better terms, and I think closer linkage to the processors and closer linkage to some of the trading companies, because the RCN trade will be there for many years to come. We know that. And finally, we need to ask a huge question. Is this system sustainable in an age of climate change? There is a risk that the growth in the industry, which seems now likely to take off again from next year, there's a good chance that that can cause the industry to be so unsustainable as to be unacceptable eventually to consumers in many countries. Those are some of the issues. Those are some of the events in the market as I see them. Obviously, it's a personal opinion. I'd love to hear your comments or your chat. And let me pass you back to Blessing. Blessing.
Hi, Jim. Thank you very much, Jim, for another session. Yes, we do have some questions here, and I would also like to inform our participants that you could ask questions or interact with Jim directly. All you need to
Recording stopped.
Activate the raise hand feature. We will unmute you, and then you could ask Jim your questions directly. That said, Jim, the first question goes like this. Thank you, Jim, for this great presentation. In what ways can buyers be more serious about sustainability? And then aside African processors being more serious about marketing, how can they be supported to buy early in the coming season?
Well, I think buyers ideally should identify the carbon footprint of what they do. I mean, have a look at where your cashews come from. I did an exercise recently calculating that a cashew could travel 30,000 miles from origin to get to a buyer in the United States. I mean, that's quite remarkable. And simply looking at that, talking to your customer, talking to a supermarket to explain that, and getting that message across to customers at the consumer level is really important. And we don't do that. Buyers generally don't do that. There are exceptions, of course, but that would be a big step towards sustainability. And I think that the key thing here is that the industry takes charge of this before governments do. If governments in the West, if the European Union takes charge of enforcing sustainability rules on the cashew sector, well, we're all going to be in trouble, and it will be very difficult. How can African processors be supported to buy early in the coming season? Get the seasons off to an early start. If you're going to make decisions on pricing, on reference pricing, make them early, make them linked to the market. Allow processors to understand what's going on in their own market early in the year. That would be a big help. Access to finance is important. That's a little bit more difficult, but I think that we're now looking at a situation where the process has been proven as workable and effective. There are enough success stories. So bringing that to financial institutions, making financial institutions in African countries understand the viability of the cashew sector, understand the opportunity in the cashew sector, could be a big factor in supporting processors to buy early. But the best way to buy early is to take the long-term approach and develop your supply chain so that you know which farmers you're buying from, where they are, and you have a long-term relationship with them. That won't be established by the next season, but those other factors might help. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question is, managing informal trade. How can CICC manage this situation?
Well, that's a great question for CICC, and I'm sure that Andre has pretty good answers to that. What would I say? I would say encouraging dialogue between countries where this is an issue. And we all know which borders are particularly porous, if I can use that word. We see organizations, again, like Lift Cashew in Sagabi, trying to encourage dialogue between countries to understand the impact of this trade. And as I said earlier, sometimes it's positive, sometimes it's negative. It does need to be addressed, in my opinion. CICC is a very good vehicle to encourage that dialogue. All understanding starts with dialogue and information, and I think that should be the role of CICC. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question is, increasing local processing and incentivizing local processing is sacrificing prices of farmers for the benefit of a few elite processors. Is this the best model of growing African processing and value addition?
Well, I mean, okay, let's say that's correct. Let's say that statement is correct. I'm not saying it is. I don't say I agree with it, but let's assume it's correct. So if you're incentivizing local processing and sacrificing prices for farmers for the benefit of a few elite processors, just add on to that. And the choice is either to do that in Africa or in Vietnam. Take your pick. That's the first thing. Now, I don't actually agree that that's true, because the evidence shows that where processors are linked to farmers and farmer groups, and there's plenty of examples of this in Vietnam, in India, and elsewhere, what actually happens is that processors pay a better price. That's the second fact. So developing processing tends to increase the price for farmers, not to reduce them. Is this the best model of growing African processing and value addition? Well, what's the alternative? Is the alternative to process abroad? Well, we've seen what that does. Is the alternative to bring in processors from the outside? Well, we've seen what that does too. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. The evidence appears to be that the large industrialized parks tend to pay lower prices, tend to put local processors out of business. So I don't think that the idea of a few elite processors actually exists. There are big processors, there are small processors, there are good ones, there are poor ones, there are ones that pay fair prices, there are ones that don't care about the farmers that supply them. Building the supply chain, integrating it, discourages poor behavior. So I do think that increasing local processing is not only the best model, I think it's the only model. Because as I said, in time, the need for sustainability can destroy the industry. If we're unable to offer consumers sustainable products over the long run, they won't buy them. And although people love cashews, and although they buy more and more every year, if cashew kernels were to disappear from the world, maybe with the exception of India, I'm not sure that consumers would be particularly regretting that 10 years from now. So I think local processing and incentivizing it is important. I agree that the method of incentivization and that the giving advantages to one processor over another doesn't make any sense, except in the case where that processor has qualified through their actions, not through their location, not through their nationality, but through their actions for some additional process advantage. So for example, if you ask, should a local owned processor get an additional incentive to an international investor? I don't think so. In most countries, it's the opposite way around. I think all process should be supported, but there shouldn't be any particular advantage except in a case where someone has performed better or offers something more, pays fair wages, for example. These all should be qualifications for incentive. That's a really great question. The more I think about the question, the more I like it. So thanks for that question. I probably can't give it the attention it deserves in the short time available to us, but there's some thoughts from my side. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, James. What do you think about processing agreements between countries to upscale processing capacity?
Processing agreements between countries, I presume, in African countries. I guess that's what's meant by the question. I hope I'm right with that. Yeah, why not? I mean, if there is to my mind, it would be the ideal situation would be that the raw cashew nuts could cross borders to the most advantageous point of process and export. I don't think that they should be freely allowed cross borders for export, but I think they should be freely allowed cross borders for processing. And I think that if there is a factory in one country that can do a good job, it should be allowed to do it, and that will lift the performance of all factories. So I think it's a good idea. I'm not sure it needs agreements between countries. What it needs is a regulation that facilitates that. Now, there would be one thing to make sure, and that is that the situation where the product is exported cross-border for processing, there would have to be a confirmation that it was processed. That would be important so that you don't get abuses of the system to avoid export taxation on raw cashew nuts. So it's an interesting thought. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question is, do you think there is a missing gap in capacity building among African stakeholders? How can the African cashew industry improve in general?
Well, let's say, first of all, the African cashew industry today is remarkably different to where it was 15 years ago. It's different in its capacity, it's different in its production, it's different in its processing, it's different in its regulation, its policy, its understanding, and most of that's been really positive. So I think that we should recognize that there's been tremendous progress made. It should, of course, be continuous improvement. Again, I would come back to this idea of working on the supply chain, integrating processing and export into the supply chain, leading to less opportunistic trading, perhaps less volatility in the market, and better relationships between producers and either export traders or processors, and particularly processors, because I think that can have a really positive impact on the producers, which are most important, but also often the weakest members of the chain. I think there is a little bit of a missing gap in capacity building. I think areas like market information, in relation to actual actors in the sector, but also in relation to financial institutions, is important. I think a better understanding of how the market works. I think a better understanding amongst politicians when they set out policies is really important. And I think one thing that we all could benefit from, and there are pretty good examples in some countries, Cote d'Ivoire comes to mind, is training of cashew managers, training of supervisors, training of machine operators in factories. I think this could have a huge impact. And there is a lot of expertise on that, but growth has been so fast that I think probably the industry now is getting into a situation where it's desperately in need of good quality factory managers. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. I have a few more questions. Godfrey is asking, do you support industrial zones as a solution for African countries to increase domestic processing quickly? Do we have a case study to support this move towards industrial zones?
Good question, Godfrey. Thank you for that. We don't have a case study to support that that's related to cashew nuts. There are case studies related to other products that would seem to be positive. That doesn't mean that they'll necessarily be positive for cashews. We've also seen that there have been huge difficulties in the cashew sector in putting together industrial zones. For me, I think that the key thing about these zones is that they be located in the right place, that they be of the right scale, that they have genuine long-term investors. They can serve as centers of excellence, if you like, or centers of improvement. They're certainly not the panacea. They're certainly not the answer in terms of build these and everything will be fine. They can cause as many problems as they solve. So therefore, I think that there is a place for them. I don't think that putting up, as we've seen, putting up large industrial zones close to the coast is going to solve any problem in the sector. It creates as many problems as it solves. But I do think that building zones with facilities, with infrastructure in the producing areas could have a very positive impact on the cashew sector, particularly if they're well managed. And one of the things would be to integrate buyers into this. How many times have we seen situations where big projects have been developed without talking to the buyers, and once developed, the sponsors, the investors, the managers, only then they start to look for buyers. And that's a key issue when establishing these things. So I think that there's room for these, but I think the business model has to be very closely looked at if we're to avoid the situation where we get even more, as we call them, white elephants, things that really should never have existed in the sector. Good question, Godfrey. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question, do you think banning export of RCN, like one proposed in Benin, is a good idea to support industry? Will it not reduce farmers' income?
Yeah, I do. I think that it will reduce farm income. I don't think that blanket bans on the export of raw cashew nuts are the way to go. I think that they should only be considered if you have the capacity to process all of your crop, if processors are well established and there is competition between processors. So I would be of a view that the main impact of a ban on the export of raw cashew will be a reduction in the farm gate price. And that's certainly a risk. I think also that farmers and traders and other actors are resourceful people, and what we will see in African countries is an increase in cross-border trade. So there's no point really in banning the export of raw cashew nuts, except A, if you can process all of it and there's competition to keep the price at the farm gate at a reasonable level, at a living level, to cover farmers' costs and let them make a margin. Secondly, there's no point in banning the export of raw cashew nuts if you can't enforce it. Put the two things together and the export ban looks, at best, extremely high risk, at worst, destructive and impractical. So I think it's a good question, and I would be very concerned about that question. There are better ways to do this. There are better ways to support local processing while still supporting farmers and increasing production. Thank you for bringing up that issue. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. And the next question says, we have assisted Côte d'Ivoire in subsidizing export canals along the past years, and some investors are using these conditions to invest in southern countries. What is the impact of the subsidy strategies? Is there sustainability, especially in countries which are facing challenges on investing to improve production, productivity, and value addition?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think the thing with subsidies is that, in my view, it definitely has been effective in Côte d'Ivoire in increasing the investment in processing. Like any kind of subsidy, it does sometimes encourage inefficiency or attract investors that otherwise would not get involved. And that means that it's a great way to kickstart, but it may not be the right way to continue. Now, how long do you continue the subsidy is a really big question from my point of view. And when you remove that subsidy, as I was saying a little bit earlier in the big issues section, what happens when you remove it? If you remove that subsidy, are those factories going to disappear? And if they do, is that a problem? Will those factories be bought out by others? Will the industry rationalize in a logical way? So, allied to that also, of course, is subsidies are a really expensive way to do this. Côte d'Ivoire is the only country in the world that directly subsidizes processing, but that is funded through a vast export of raw cashew nuts. And that makes sense. If you can use some of the taxation on the export of raw cashew nuts to support a subsidy to increase processing, that makes sense. If you don't have that option, then it's probably not realistic to establish the subsidies. I think that there is a general interest in investing in the cashew sector at the moment. I think there is an interest in investment, and we see in countries without subsidies, we're seeing investment interest. So I don't think that subsidies are a necessary precondition for investment in processing. And I do think that there are risks around it. So it may be suitable for a large country with a very big crop to kickstart its processing. It remains to be seen what happens when those subsidies are phased out, as inevitably they must be, and how that will affect weaker factories, how it will affect the attitudes of the stronger factories too. So I think in general terms, subsidies have had a positive impact, but they have a lifetime, and that may be 5 years, and that perhaps if you were considering introducing them, that you would consider a short lifetime on them. I think also before introducing them, it's important to assess the current investment situation. Are there other factors that will preclude investment in processing, or is there already enough interest in processing to make the subsidies unnecessary? So it's complex, and the impact needs to be closely studied, and we really will only get an idea of what that means when subsidies in Côte d'Ivoire are phased out and we see the reaction to that. See the questions from Lucia Antonio from Mozambique, who I thank for a really great presentation a couple of sessions ago, and greetings to her. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. The next question is, Mozambique has a large percentage of processing and an incentivizing model through taxes, but that has resulted in significantly lower farmer prices compared to Tanzania, which exports more. Isn't it the case that processing will eventually be done where it is cheapest? Until African processors compete on price and favorable trade agreements, they will still struggle to create a large impact. How long do you think it would take African processors to compete on price?
African processors are already competing on price. Price is made up of a lot of factors other than just the bottom line number. Price is made up of a mix of quality, location, capacity, costs, relationships, food safety. All of these factors have an impact. And I would say that when we look at the trend, what we're seeing is that a number of African processors are competitive on price. In Mozambique, I think that lower farm prices are also related to quality of raw material. When we think about the concept of processing always finding its way to where it's done cheapest, it may be true, but we have to consider the supply chain costs. So if it costs $300 a ton to move the product from the farm gate to the processor in Vietnam, and $300 would be a lowish number, that's also part of the cost. So that means that if it costs, let's say, $80 a ton to move it from the farm gate to a local processor compared to $350, there's a significant cost margin there in which the processor can strive for competitiveness. It does not only have to be based on the simple idea of it's $200 a ton in one place and $300 a ton in another. How long will it take African processing to compete on price? It's happening. And I think that within 5 years, we will see a turnaround in that, and we will see greater export. Look at the numbers, look at the improvement, look at the exports of cashew kernels from Cote d'Ivoire, for example, and see how that's going. And you can start to see a picture that African processors are becoming competitive on price, but that price just isn't simply that bottom line number of $2 and something or $3 and something per pound. Thanks for that question. Interesting one. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Tim. We have another question all the way from Senegal. In West Africa, cashew is produced on family farms that incorporate cashew, cotton, peanut, and cereals. How can we improve the integration of these crops and avoid unprofitable competition?
It's not only in West Africa, of course, that cashews are produced by smallholders and family farms. It's almost everywhere in the world. Yeah, it's a really interesting point that Monsieur Balde raises, and I think one of the things that we might consider is to look at integrated marketing of products and to look at how these products relate to each other. And one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is to assess what is the actual place of cashews in the local farm family's economy. So what place does cashews play? What is the money used for? What does it pay for? How does it work? But I think that one of the things, and we probably need to think more of farmers as business people. Often farmers are neglected, left out, maybe apart from election time. And we should start to look at farmers as business people and support them as business people. This is a question, it's a really good question, and it's in a way beyond my brief because I'm not that knowledgeable on cotton and cereals. I certainly know something about peanuts, but I would love to see some more work on that. For me, the key thing is to treat farm families as business people and to support them accordingly. Blessing.
Thank you very much, Tim. The last question is, how can governments support increasing financing of RCN purchases for local processors? Are there any successful examples?
So it looks like we're going to finish the year on the most asked question that I hear, and it's about working capital and financing for processors. Well, the successful examples I've seen have been methods to collateralize inventory so that processors can borrow against the inventory they have. I've seen examples, not very many, but examples of prepayment from buyers, which have been also important. I think that there is definitely a reluctance in financial institutions to support cashew units at this time. I think that's largely due to a lack of understanding of the sector and where it's gone in recent years. But I think some of it's very justified because we have seen the cashew sector as quite a high risk sector over the years. So what governments can do is support financial institutions to operate in the cashew sector. In some cases, that might be guarantees or limited guarantees, and that we have seen has been successful in some countries. And what we have seen in some countries also is close links between farmer organizations and processors and financial institutions encouraged by the government, and that too has worked quite well. We don't have too many successes in this area in West Africa, although we do see processing develop, but we still have the problem of poor business planning. And I think maybe that's a key aspect of this too, in that we often see a case where a factory is built without enough thought given to how the working capital will be financed. It's all very well to build a 5,000 ton factory, and then you need $3.5–4 million to buy the raw material in a period of 3 or 4 months of the year. So sometimes it's mentioned that the mechanisms that can allow processors to hold the stock in secure warehousing, financed by financial institutions, can work. But I often think that they go too far and they develop into auction systems, or they develop into farmer marketing systems, which in the end turn out to be too complex. I think the financing should be focused on the processor. And I think that I've given you 3 areas where I think there could be improvements. I'd love to see a really successful example in some country that we could use and apply elsewhere. Thanks for that question. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Tim. I know I had mentioned that was the last question, but another question just arrived. It says, how much of a threat does Indian and Cambodian expanding production is to the African production? Are we seeing a carryover situation again this year? How does El Nino affect the coming year?
So no, we're not seeing a big carryout this year. I was saying that during the presentation. I don't think that Indian production poses much of a threat. India would like to increase its cashew production, but hasn't really managed to do so in recent years. The production growth has been slow in India. Now, I think that will accelerate a little bit, but I still don't see it as a threat to Africa in any way. Cambodian production, well, we got this huge surge in Cambodian production, and now we've seen that track back. This year, as we were saying, exports to Vietnam, about 611,000 tons. That suggests production maybe 620, 625, something like that. Therefore, whereas I do think Cambodian production can increase, I don't think it does so in a way that it becomes a threat to African production. If we look at the last 2 years, production has continued to move positively in a time of low prices. We have seen a situation where large carryouts from 2022 have mainly been dealt with, and we see a situation where production, having risen sharply, seems to be beginning to stabilize again. So I don't really see a major threat in the short term. And I think that lower prices will keep that under control. If we got a price bubble, we again might see a fast increase in some areas in production. How does El Nino affect the coming year? Undoubtedly, it will affect the coming year. It can affect the coming year by poor weather in Cambodia and Vietnam would be vulnerable. Although so far there's nothing too untoward there. We've seen some strange weather in India over the course of 2023. You wouldn't normally expect a huge impact of El Nino in India, in South India, but you never know, that could happen. So it's likely to be on production. It could also affect the Brazilian crop of 2024. Unlikely to affect West Africa's crop, as the impact, according to what I understand, the impact on West Africa is less than elsewhere. So I think we need to look out for hot, dry weather during flowering, heavy showers perhaps that can damage flowering, and that can have a big impact. We need also to look out for diseases on cashew trees, and that's a little bit more difficult to spot. The weather we can follow, diseases will only become apparent later in the year. So there is a chance of a big impact. I think the current situation of low prices, relatively low carry-out stocks, and the potential for damage to the crop, it could be that next year could be difficult, but I'm not saying that there's anything there right now that is saying that. I want to be very clear about that, but the potential is there. So watch it closely is all I can say. Back to you, Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim. That will be all the questions. And of course, before we wrap the session, we'd definitely like to hear from you what we should look out for. Today being the last GME for 2023 and resuming in 2024 GME, what should be, what should the guiding words for stakeholders until we bring GME back?
Well, we've been talking about a lot of the different points. I think that keep a close eye on RCN imports over the coming months and demand for RCN over the coming weeks. That gives us a really good indication. I would keep a close eye on the behavior of the US market, buying their imports into the US. If the US market were to turn around and start to go back to a growth pattern, it would have a significant impact. I would keep, obviously, and we've just been talking about it, keep a close eye on the weather in a strong El Nino. Very important to keep an eye on the weather, particularly Southeast Asia and Southern India. The situation coming into the early part of the Northern Hemisphere crop is going to be very interesting. It looks as if raw cashew nut buyers will have enough inventory to carry them through, and that's one of the reasons they've been buying. If there was a situation where they felt that the production in their own country or elsewhere was threatened, then at low prices, it's quite easy that the market could react quickly. That's more likely to be seen on kernels initially. So if you're in the RCN business, or if you're a producer, keep a close eye on what's happening on kernels. I don't expect huge volatility in the coming weeks, but next year could be quite a year. I have the feeling that we'll be returning to strong demand, possible production disruption, and maybe something of a rationalization in Vietnam and possibly also in Cote d'Ivoire. Looks like an interesting time, but then isn't it always in cashews? So I'd just like to finish today our 61st GME by thanking everyone who's joined us today and throughout 2023 and before, and a special thanks to the interpreters, the support staff, and everyone who's made it possible and enjoyable to do these webinars, and particularly to you, Blessing. Thanks very much indeed. I look forward to doing this again sometime.
Thank you very much, Jim. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this GME, which happens to be the last one for 2023. We'll resume again 2024. And would like to thank all our sponsors and partners who have continually supported us to bring these sessions to you. And of course, to you, Jim, our host for 61 episodes of Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Thank you very much. And we would also like to extend our gratitude to the technical team, to the interpretation team for the support, for the work done throughout the year. We wish you all a safe and happy holidays and look forward to a fruitful new year. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.
contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous les avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné l'ATDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora Donga, Bogo, Albori, Zoukoline, le centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces 2 organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Bassila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Takayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Cashew is an increasingly important crop for the countries in West Africa. For Benin, it's their second most valuable export. And we saw this big potential to grow and increase more.
Le cajou arrive en seconde place après le coton. À 110 000, 120 000 tonnes, en 2 ans, nous sommes passés à 120, 130, 140 000 tonnes. L'objectif du gouvernement, c'est d'aller à 300 000 tonnes à la fin du quinquennat.
Cashew me permet de vivre. Au moment où je n'avais pas suivi avec Cashew Bénin, les 2 hectares font 5 sacs. Et maintenant, avec Cashew Bénin, je vends 15 sacs cette année. Le projet nous a appris beaucoup de choses.
Il a formé 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et 1 homme.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Benin Cashew is an innovative program aimed at strengthening and growing the Beninese cashew sector. Its goal is to create a more productive, competitive, sustainable, and inclusive economic growth engine for the people of Benin. It's being funded by the USDA and is being implemented by TechnoServe and our partners at CRS. Over 8 years, Benin Cashew will increase the yields and incomes of more than 49,000 smallholder farmers, triple Benin's domestic processing capacity, create more than 3,400 jobs, most of which will be held by women, and will position the entire sector for continued growth long after the project ends.
Technoserve travaille avec des hommes et des femmes pour bâtir des fermes et des entreprises compétitives qui contribuent à la réduction de la pauvreté, à l'augmentation de la résilience des bénéficiaires et de leur communauté. Nous restons convaincus que la participation pleine et entière des femmes et des filles permet de maximiser la croissance économique inclusive pour un développement généralisé. Au sein de la production agricole et notamment dans la filière cajou, bien que présentes, les femmes sont confrontées à des difficultés en ce qui concerne l'accès aux facteurs de production, notamment la terre, les ressources financières, la technologie et les formations. Au début du projet Benin Cashew, la participation des femmes était d'environ 20,57%. À fin décembre 2020, ce taux est passé à 34,67% au sein de la production et à 39% au sein du projet. L'objectif étant d'atteindre au moins 40% de participation des femmes. Pour atteindre ce résultat, nous avons mis en place un dispositif institutionnel avec tous les partenaires du projet pour intégrer le genre au sein de toutes les activités de ce projet. Nous avons un dispositif basé sur des points focaux genre qui ont reçu des formations sur différentes techniques, différentes thématiques. Nous avons mené aussi un plaidoyer pour la modification des tests statutaires des fêtières des producteurs de cajou afin d'alléger les conditions d'accès des femmes aux coopératives. Et nous avons pu avoir une femme présidente du conseil d'administration de la fêtière des producteurs d'anacarde et une femme présidente du conseil de surveillance de cette même organisation, ce qui est une première au Bénin au sein de la filière anacarde.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes, surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
J'ai constaté qu'avec cette formation, la femme a un grand rôle à jouer pour l'émancipation et la prospérité, bien partagée qu'à l'intérieur, qu'à l'extérieur, au sein du foyer. Grâce à cette même formation, la population, mais la communauté a un regard craintif en nous. Ils nous copient, ils voient la manière dont nous vivons avec mon épouse. Grâce à cette formation, nous avons pu réaliser beaucoup de choses.
Cette formation que nous avons eue sur le champ nous a réveillés par rapport à la femme, parce que dans le maillon production, on a constaté que les femmes n'ont pas accès à la terre, donc du coup, elles sont marginalisées. Donc sur le terrain, nous voyons à ce que les femmes sont prises en compte. Et comme le projet le recommande 40% de femmes, il faut dire que ce n'est pas facile. 40% des femmes dans tout ce que nous faisons, on doit pouvoir toucher au moins 40% de femmes.
Maya was founded in 1993 and listed on the air share market in 2012. Maya is China's leading high-tech enterprise focusing on the R&D and manufacturing of optotronic intelligent identification equipment. Maya is committed to applying intelligent identification technology to cashew sorting and processing by developing a full range of cashew color sorters, such as CF series, KM series, KF series, KFS3 series, K4 series, KS4 series, CG.A series, M series, XS series, XM series, XL series, etc. The whole scene sorting solution can be provided to raw cashew separation, whole cashew separation, split separation, broken pieces separation, tester separation, squash separation, medium spot separation, shell separation, foreign material separation, and so on. Maya brand new cashew color sorter equipped with AI deep learning technology based on massive cashew sorting data can quickly build and iterate deep learning sorting models to break the problems of micro color difference, mold and spores which are difficult to solve with traditional color sorters, significantly improving the sorting efficiency and impurities such as single spot, multiple spot, micro color difference, skin, insect spots, mold and wrinkled skin of cashew kernels. In addition, based on engineering design and intelligent manufacturing, the structure of the whole machine is highly standardized and modularized, which greatly enhance the stability and reliability. Maya is dedicated to creating more value for cashew processors.
Je m'appelle Sinagero Kalilaku. J'ai 28 ans. Je suis née à Ina, dans la commune de Bembereke. Je suis mariée et nous avons 2 enfants. Quand je me réveille, je fais d'abord mes travaux domestiques. Je balaie la cour, la chambre, je lave mes bols. Je prépare le petit déjeuner pour la famille et je viens travailler en pépinière. C'est en 2019 que j'ai commencé par collaborer avec le projet Benekadjo. Quand j'ai connu le projet Benekadjo, on est rentré dans le système de professionnalisation. Et dans ce système, à cette date, nous avons déjà reçu 5 modules de formation. En plus de la pépinière d'Anakadi, nous faisons la pépinière des manguis et des autres essences forestières. Après ça, nous faisons les cultures vivrières telles que le soja, l'arachide, le niébé. En dehors de ça, nous faisons le levage. On fait le levage des porcs et le levage des volailles. Pendant la pandémie du Covid-19, nous n'avons pas connu de difficultés par rapport à la main-d'œuvre. La main-d'œuvre était toujours disponible. La pandémie du Covid-19 a engendré des impacts dans notre entreprise parce qu'il y a eu la baisse du prix d'achat des produits. Benekadjo nous a aidés. Parce qu'on continuait par suivre les formations sur la professionnalisation et à chaque formation, on recevait la réponse sur le Covid-19. Après ce programme de professionnalisation qui est toujours en cours, on a appris à faire le bokashi. Le bokashi nous permet d'augmenter la production. Nous avons effectué un voyage en Tanzanie où on a appris beaucoup de choses sur l'agronomie de l'Anakadi. Mes ambitions, c'est d'abord être compté parmi les plus grands pépiniéristes du Bénin. Aller à une production de 50 000 plants. Je veux avoir également un site moderne. Nous souhaitons que Benekadjo continue par nous appuyer surtout sur les aspects techniques de la production. Benekadjo nous a apporté beaucoup de choses, beaucoup de connaissances. Je remercie sincèrement le projet Bénin Cashew pour ses efforts à mon niveau et de ne pas cesser de continuer toujours car on ne finit jamais d'apprendre.
Recording in progress.
En relation avec l'objectif du gouvernement d'augmenter la production, qui aujourd'hui est de l'ordre de 130 000 tonnes à 300 000 tonnes d'ici les 5 prochaines années, il s'est avéré nécessaire de disposer d'un matériel végétal performant de plantation, ce qui a amené le projet Bénin Cashew à accompagner la production de ce matériel végétal performant à travers d'abord les acteurs qui sont les pépiniéristes, dont la structuration a été accompagnée, et ensuite maintenant la recherche qui aujourd'hui fait l'objet d'un accompagnement à travers l'installation de 2 sites qui vont abriter les vergers de production de semences polyclonales qui puissent permettre d'atteindre l'objectif d'augmentation de la production de plants d'anacarde.
En termes d'action, Technoserve à travers Bénin Cashew a 3 axes. Le premier axe, c'est augmenter de façon quantitative les arbres mères. Ce que nous appelons arbres mères, c'est ces arbres d'anacarde qui peuvent permettre en réalité d'offrir des greffons aux pépiniéristes afin quand même d'offrir aux producteurs des plants greffés. Le deuxième axe d'intervention, c'est ces semences l'axe qui permet d'installer 2 vergers de production de semences polyclonales, un verger de 12 hectares à Orgui dans la commune de Savet, et un verger de 12 hectares à Ina dans la commune de Bembereke. Le troisième axe d'intervention de Bénin Cashew en termes d'appui, c'est le renforcement des capacités. Et à ce titre, Technoserve a pris l'engagement d'accompagner 7 jeunes et cadres au niveau du ministère de l'Agriculture pour les envoyer en formation.
Technoserve nous a appuyés pour un voyage en Tanzanie. Et là, nous avons découvert de très merveilleuses manières de travail, telles que le greffage sur bois mou. Nous avons aussi reçu les techniques de fabrication de bokashi. Le bokashi, c'est un engrais organique. Bénin Cashew Technoserve a financé le voyage des experts d'autres pays qui sont venus nous apprendre cette technique de fabrication de bokashi.
L'Institut national de recherche agricole du Bénin a certaines faiblesses que la coopération avec Technoserve est en train de combler en termes d'infrastructures de conservation de ce matériel, en termes de ressources humaines capables de gérer convenablement ce patrimoine génétique. Nous avons déjà, avec l'appui de Technoserve, identifier des arbres élites performants d'Anacadier dont nous allons utiliser les potentiels pour dupliquer et avoir beaucoup d'autres matériels. Nous avons aussi avec TechnoServe le contact avec des pays comme la Tanzanie, le Mozambique qui ont de l'expérience en matière de production de cajou et donc on pourrait bien les rattraper.
L'importance de l'installation de ce verger est d'augmenter la quantité de matériel végétal de qualité pour permettre aux producteurs d'avoir un rendement plus élevé à l'hectare.
Nous avons aujourd'hui 3 conseillers d'entreprise qui encadrent la cinquantaine de pépiniéristes dûment identifiés, sélectionnés avec l'appui du gouvernement pour que cette production repose sur des techniques managériales, entrepreneuriales qui permettent à ces pépiniéristes de jouer un rôle prépondérant dans l'atteinte de l'objectif de l'augmentation de la production de notre cajou.
Le rôle du pépiniériste, nous sommes les gardiens du matériel végétal, qui est un patrimoine pour notre pays. Donc sans le pépiniériste, le matériel végétal performant vont disparaître. Ce que Benin Cashew a fait pour moi, permettez-moi de le dire, ils m'ont beaucoup appuyé, surtout la formation des femmes. Donc on a eu à former 10 personnes, dont 9 femmes et un homme. Benin Cashew est comme la levure dans la farine de blé qui fait lever le pain. J'ai pu avoir beaucoup de choses. Je me suis acheté un domaine où je suis en train de construire une maison familiale actuellement. Et à côté,